Welcome back to AIM Research. This event is hosted by the Center for Academic Innovation and aims to act as a center for conversation, inspiration, and research to inform educational innovation of all kinds. If you have ideas for people we should be inviting to come join us for one of these, please do send them my way. This is a monthly speaker series with an agenda for the winter live on our website. You can check out all of Academic Innovation's events here, and I have pasted that in the chat. Today's presentation will be recorded and posted on our CAI YouTube channel. Feel free to submit your questions for our speaker in the Zoom chat, and we'll conclude recording and talk through those in a rich conversation after at the end. Joining us today is Juan Pablo Sarmiento to share his work on From Human-Centered Design to the Design of Human Systems, Participatory Design in Learning Analytics. Juan is a PhD student and researcher in the Learning Analytics Research Network at New York University. He has a strong focus on participatory design and has worked on a number of projects leveraging these techniques to develop learning analytics tools and improve student experience. His research has been recognized with several awards, including the Best Short Paper at the 11th International Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference for his work on subversive learning analytics, and the Best Practitioner Report at the 10th International Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference for his collaboration on engaging students as co-designers of learning analytics. In addition to his research, he has co-authored a toolkit for digital learning titled Reclaiming Digital Futures. Juan, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to see you all here. Very, very honored to be giving this talk. Okay, so I'll start trying to share my screen. Great. Okay, so today's talk is titled Participatory and Co-Design of Learning Analytics, from Human-Centered Design to the Design of Human Systems and, or I would say, human communities. The purpose of this talk is to talk a little bit about kind of like how we tend to think about learning analytics as a tool, what are some of the ways in which participatory design has been used within learning analytics, some examples, and kind of where my thinking has been going, and where I think the discipline maybe wants to kind of like start moving to truly start to move beyond kind of the user to the system and the community. So, sorry, I'm having a. Okay, there we go. So, it has a little bit of delay, so it struck me. Anyway, so I come from the NYU Learn Research Network. We are a research network that works with creating kind of like human-centered experiences, learning analytics. We don't just create the tools, but create partnerships across the university with researchers, practitioners, users, instructors, and always trying to kind of use human-centered design to innovate and to investigate teaching and the learning practices with technology. Also, it's really important to us to do this through an equitable perspective, and hopefully that some of that will kind of like seep in through the talk today. Now, before we actually get into the talk itself, I have like a little exercise for you and for you at home, I guess, that I want us to kind of like take a second to rethink education. I don't know if you've ever heard of blue sky thinking, this idea of just kind of like have crazy ideas about, you know, like if you had a magic wand and you could just change everything, take away all the constraints that we have. So I'll give you guys 45 seconds if you have a piece of paper with you or you want to kind of like write it down. I do appreciate if you actually write this down. Just take 30 awkward seconds to think about 2 or 3 things that you would like education to do completely differently, right? I mean, you look at this picture, this is kind of like what education has been for the past 150 years. It hasn't changed much. So how else would you do it? What will make that education be the one that we want? Or are there any ways in which maybe education is not including all of us? maybe think about the ways in which education can help us to participate in society differently. Or how could it encourage the true values that we want in our society? What are those true values that are important to us, and how could we bring those to the education space? Okay, great. 30 seconds gone. Hopefully you guys wrote something down, and maybe it will resonate with the rest of the stuff that I will be saying here today. But yeah, that's kind of like a big question for me, like what is the better vision of education, and how can we use learning analytics to take us to that place? This, by the way, is not learning analytics, but it's a bit of a metaphor. This is function. You're like wondering, did I go to a wrong talk to the urbanist center? No, this is functionalist architecture, okay? And it's a bit of a metaphor of education right now. It is good. It can be replicated in all sorts of places and circumstances. It's scalable, comparatively inexpensive, and of course, many of our campuses actually kind of look a little bit like this, right? But if we go back to our visions of education, maybe our visions don't look quite like this, right? And this architecture, as good as it is for some things, also has some challenges. It is not adjusting to the environment. It feels imposed. It feels, in some ways, kind of inhuman. And what we have been doing sometimes in education and technology, and learning analytics in specific, has been kind of this, right? We have improved on what exists, but in a by small steps, right? There's put a little tree here. We try to deal with this challenge there. We see that it doesn't quite fit, our environment or kind of what humans should be doing. So we try to create fixes to these systems that exist. But what happens if what we ultimately want is for education to look like the image on the right? This is an example of organic architecture. And it's not only an aesthetic movement. Organic architecture actually wants to be embedded in the environment in many different ways, and it's answering different questions that what the functionalist architecture is doing. It tries to kind of be in a dialogue with the space where it's located in the ways that maybe education could be in a dialogue with what we believe it means to be human. So the question, right, is gradual improvement the answer? And if not, why is it the way that we have been trying to answer this question constantly, right? Okay. So ultimately, with the work that we're doing with technology and education, is our aim to just perpetuate the status quo of education, or do we want to find ways to actually transform it? So the roadmap for today's talk, first we're going to talk a little bit about participatory design, right? And how it has been used within learning analytics. And you'll see very clearly where those gaps are between how participatory design could be used and how it might lead to these more utopic and kind of like big picture ideas of education, and what are some of the limitations of the methods that have been used so far. Then I'm going to share a couple of stories with you, one from some research that I did, and then some from a colleague's research at UCI, that are actually some interesting, good examples of using PD within learning analytics, and also kind of suggest some of the ways in which our framing of human-centered design might have some limitations. And then we'll talk about those limitations and how we start moving from designing for humans to designing with humans to designing with humans, but also for communities, for systems. And participatory design. So why do we do participatory design? Why do we do human-centered design at all? Well, within the community of learning analytics, there has been an increasing interest in human-centered methods. They give the pragmatic promise of creating more usable, useful, and impactful tools for design, right? Probably everybody here in this room has heard a lot about human-centered design already. So participatory design in particular is very promising as a human-centered design method. First of all, it can help you alleviate some of the discrepancies between the tools that we create and people's needs. You bring them in the room and they can share their experience. It can also help you deal with some of the challenges of trust that tools that use surveillance like learning analytics can create, right? One challenge is, is why are you using my data? If you bring people that actually can let you know what are the ways in which they are uncomfortable, this can actually help you create just better designs. Ultimately, however, and here I'm quoting Harmlin and Workman, a paper from 2012, LA is part of like bigger socio-technical systems where human decision making and the actions have an impact and are in dialogue with these technical components. So it is important to bring people to try to better understand the system and those different ways in which we nudge and encourage and create actions with the tools that we are developing. Here, it's also important to say that it encourages a deeper involvement of stakeholders, because sometimes when we talk about human-centered design, we actually are thinking about any involvement of humans, and we throw a survey to tell you whether this thing worked or not for you, with a very kind of constrained space for feedback, and that is also called human-centered design. PD is in some ways a lot deeper in terms of the involvement. Okay, so what is participatory design? So as a discipline, PD arose in the 1980s, and it was very much concerned with the disruptive role that technology could have in the lives of people. So in that way, it's kind of different from a lot of what maybe you have heard about human-centered design and HCI practices. The core of HCI kind of emerged from trying to make design better, right? So we were creating computers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and our managers were having trouble because the operators didn't know what to do. So we started creating this human-centered design, especially in particular of interfaces early on, to just get the work done in a better way. Participatory design emerges sort of independently as a coalition of researchers, trade unions, and designers. And the idea was to deal with the fears that the unions and the workers were having in terms of how technology was going to disrupt their work and disrupt their lives. So the question is very different, right? It's a question that in some ways is political, because it deals with who has power when it comes to the changing of your life through a technology. And it's also value-centered, because they wanted to emancipate the workers, right? A lot of PD has been informed, for example, by the thinking of Pablo. And they wanted to basically kind of give them freedom in how the work was going to happen through the technology. So importantly, the stakeholders were not just seen as informants, as people who could bring information into the process, but also as partners, as somebody, and actually as experts, right? Designers would look at the informants, would look at the workers, and basically consider them as experts of their own lives. And research and design was very much intertwined from the beginning in this endeavor. So this is a very good graphic by Anders Sapper in a seminal paper about what design is in 2008. And this is kind of like the landscape of different human-centered design practices, right? You can have the user as a subject over here on the left, right? Ooh, what happened there? I think I might have clicked. Anyway, you can have the user as subject over here on the left, or the user as partner, as involved in the project. And traditional user-centered design, and often when we talk about human-centered design, we're talking about this, tends to center the user more as a subject, somebody who is just going to give me information to get my goal of creating a better product. However, as we move more as a designer's partner, we have those kinds of coalitions that are led by research, like what we call the Scandinavian participatory design. That is where it emerged. And then we have generative design practices. And within those practices, we have co-design. But co-design, by the way, is something that I put here on this graph. This is where it would belong, according to Sanders and Stappers, but it's not part of the original image, just to be clear. And what is co-design? Co-design is basically a step further in the development of PD. First, the practitioners of participatory research brought the users and the stakeholders into the room to discuss and to try to understand with each other better what the needs and wants were and how these products were changing in their lives. But then they also realized that these stakeholders had something to say. They had imagination, they had ideas, and they knew about design intuitively through their interaction with other technological tools, and they could imagine other technological tools. So we talk about co-design when we're not only involving our partners, but also the partners are involved creatively in the production of the things that they will eventually use. So this is kind of like the contrast between the two methods, right? On the left, we have traditional human-centered design, where you have the user over here, and a researcher that will work with the user. They will observe the user. They will do something like a contextual inquiry, which is when you follow the user and you try to better understand how technology can improve their routines and improve their lives. The researcher is also informed by theory, right? And in our case, what we know about learning, what we know about organizations. And based on that interaction, there will be some insights that are then created into a report that is fed to the designer, and then the designer goes and creates something, and maybe we'll then bring it back to the user to get some feedback. In co-design, by contrast, the user, the researcher, and the designer all work together, right? They are interacting with some tools, and these tools aim to create what is called a third space. So the researcher, right, has a space of their power and their control. The user has a space of their power and their control, which is their workplace or wherever it is that they're going to use these tools, the classrooms, say. And the designer has their space of control, which is the studio. You create a new space, sometimes literally and metaphorically, where you create these tools that are boundary objects that allow these different people that have different ways of thinking, different priorities, and different values to interact with each other and to understand each other better and to understand each other's needs better. So this third space becomes like a small community that helps the creation of these design solutions. Now for definitions, this is a definition of participatory design. It will be the set of design practices that involve stakeholders in investigating, understanding, reflecting upon, establishing, developing, and supporting this mutual learning, where everybody is an expert, between multiple participants in this collective reflection in action processes within design. What's important about here is this idea, as I said, of mutual learning, that everybody is an expert within this space, and that the reflection is not individual, but is collective. It's not just a report about what somebody needs that is then fed to somebody else, but we're all reflecting on what we need and why we need it together. Then co-design is a method of participatory design where collective creativity, that is creativity shared by two or more people, is applied by designers and people who are not necessarily trained in design, working together across a design process. Okay, so as I was saying before, we talk about co-design when we're actually designing together, when we bring the creativity of our stakeholders into the process. So to summarize, participatory design can be understood as a set of tools, so things that you're going to do to create this third space. For example, contextual inquiry is a tool. A designer interview is a tool. It is also a method. So a method would be a series of steps that you go through a process to better understand this the user and to create something new for the user. I don't know if you're familiar with design thinking. Design thinking would be an example of a method that is heavily inspired on participatory design. And it has, a phase where you empathize with your user, and you try to come up with a question, then you try to come up with solutions to the question, you prototype those, you get feedback, and then you iterate. But also, importantly, it's also a stance, right? You are thinking about what your values are and kind of like what your ethics are in terms of participatory design, right? Participatory design is also just a way of seeing the process of how we should be designing with humans, with certain values in mind. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the current landscape of participatory design within the space of learning analytics. This is based on a systematic lit review that we did with Professor Alyssa Weiss 2 years ago. We presented it 1 year ago in the LAC conference. And it basically kind of looked at all of the practices of participatory design that were being applied in learning analytics until June 2020. So the first thing that we saw is that as a technique, participatory design is used increasingly within learning analytics. There's a very marked curve here from very little use, although it was used even early on within LA, to a fair amount of papers that are responding to their use in the 2020s. By the way, an important thing, you'll see the number 52 in some of the following slides. We collected 90 papers that were that refer to the use of participatory design in learning analytics, but some of them refer to you had projects that had multiple papers referring to them. So actually, we synthesized that into 52 research efforts. So some of the things that we saw is that, unsurprisingly, instructors are by far the people who are most often brought as stakeholders to participate in participatory design in LA. They were in almost 3/4 of the projects. They were the principal stakeholder. Students were the second most consulted group. They were in 58 of the 52 projects, 58%. However, importantly, their participation tended to be more shallow than that of teachers. So if instructors would participate in things like co-design, in 1/4 of the cases in which students participated, they actually only participated through a survey. So very kind of little authentic participation going on there. Then other stakeholders were also involved, people like developers, learning experts, teaching assistants, administrative decision makers, advisors. All of these involved between 19% and 10%. So within the discipline of learning analytics, we are looking at stakeholders with a slightly kind of like biggish focus, but we still tend to kind of stay apparently pretty narrowly with the people that are directly involved with the tool, right? So if we're creating a student-facing dashboard, probably we're going to talk to the students, maybe with the faculty, but we don't involve other people that actually might be impacted by these tools, right? Because when we talk about stakeholders, we're trying to think about all of the different people that might have an impact with the tool. Interestingly, for example, parents who are an important stakeholder in K-12 were actually absent from any research within learning analytics. The number of individual voices. So when you are creating participatory design, right, the whole point of it is that you're trying to bring different perspectives into the table to better understand the ways in which what you're designing might be challenging or what these people might need. So we talk about the number of voices in terms of just how many people there were in the room that were representing different groups, and also different types of stakeholders, right? Instructors versus participants versus students versus advisors, etc. Now, here in LA, it ran the gambit. We had some projects where there was only one stakeholder, like, you know, they were basically working closely with, in 2 cases, one instructor, to some cases where actually there were hundreds of stakeholders involved through kind of multi-year, multi-district projects that involved literally hundreds of people giving feedback to a tool or trying to understand what these tools might be doing. Some interesting facts, however, is that half of the projects did consult more than one type of stakeholder, and about a quarter consulted 3 or more stakeholder groups. However, when it comes to recruitment, we rarely described how this was being done. So even though, you know, we were bringing people from different spaces, it seemed that often recruitment was actually based either on convenience sampling or in some cases with the stakeholders' familiarity with that technology. Recruitment was, by the way, only described in 13% of the projects. Okay, so there's only 6 projects actually that kind of like talked about explicitly why they were bringing these people into the room and what was the rationale behind this. This has some concerns in terms of things like equity. We know that different groups of people will have different impacts through technology. Those who belong from groups that are usually misrepresented in education, their impacts tend to be larger. So when we're not thinking about recruitment intentionally, this can have challenges in terms of not just things like usability, but truly in the ways in which what we're designing could actually cause unwanted harm. When was participatory design being conducted? It was used throughout the design process. We kind of created this distinction of before design, during design, and after design. Before design being the understanding of the needs, during design being the moment when you're actually creating artifacts that might try to solve some of those needs, and quote unquote after design is the testing of these ideas, which often leads to other phases of design. PD was used throughout. In almost 70% of the projects, it was used early, in about half of them during, and in about 40 after the design for testing and evaluation. By the way, the fact that these numbers drop is also representative that some of these projects would describe what was happening at the beginning, but then they would disappear, or they were still ongoing. So it was actually through projects that were finished. It was very often seen that they would actually do a lot of they would use lots of PD tools, participatory design tools, early to understand users' needs, and late to test the design, but not a little bit less in the middle, in the co-design phases. And co-design, by the way, was way more used in more recent papers than in papers that were 5, 6, or 8 years old. So how was participatory design being used? So before, many projects used multiple techniques to try to understand users' needs. Things like persona building or contextual inquiry and other empathy strategies were used throughout. After, there were many different ways in which you could conduct tests. There's some really interesting work by Holstein of like a series of multiple tests using this technique called okay, sorry, I just forgot the name, but it's real enactments technique to actually get a really, really vivid picture of how people could imagine the use of the data within their real discipline, and thus avoid some of the problems that you can have with use after use. And by what I mean by this is one of the things that you want to do with participatory design is get a sense of how people will use these tools in real life. Right? People often cannot really imagine how this data will be involved in their daily lives. So some of the intelligent testing techniques will actually try to create an environment where people can envision themselves using this data. Finally, with during, as I said, co-design was used to generate ideas in lots of these projects, and things like card sorting, where was one of the kind of like techniques that was most used in this part. Okay, so moving forward, where we are. So participatory design in LA seems to be on the rise. There's a growing recognition of how we could use human-centered design strategies. That's really good. And researchers were creating lots of new techniques and methods to adapt to the particular needs of data-centric design for human-centered design, right? One of the big challenges that we have with data is that a lot of our stakeholders might not be necessarily very data literate, and they might not have a vision of how data can be used to shift their routines. So, so participatory design within LA, many researchers kind of created interesting tools to try to kind of like solve this challenge. Where can we improve? Participatory design can be a lot more than just another tool for user feedback. As I said at the beginning, the traditions of participatory design come with these kind of political and value systems embedded in them. And even though when interacting with different stakeholders, sometimes these values started just emerging naturally, often it seemed that in the projects themselves, there was very little discussion about values when they were going into applying participatory design. You know, the reason behind applying PD was often mostly pragmatic, you know, like this will create better design, so we're going to bring stakeholders to get their feedback. Now, again, one of the ways in which participatory design is a little bit magic is that once you bring those people into the room, these value concerns do emerge. Things like, you know, what is happening with my privacy? Who is seeing my data? I feel uncomfortable that my data is being seen this way. How can I keep some control of these things, right? So these value questions and how the community interacts just kind of emerge once you bring those people and once you've chosen those people correctly. Also, we should be trying to open the black box of design. One challenge that we have, that we had when we created this review, is that within LA, and this happens in lots of like technology for education literature, there was very little that was written about actually what happened in the process of design, right? So we had the reason why we wanted to use these techniques. We have the results, sometimes with some statistics of how, you know, people are using these tools, but actually what the process of design was and what the interactions with the participants were that led to certain design decisions that tended to be a black box. And there's a few papers that didn't do this, and that's one of the ones that I'm sharing here today, that are using this thing called design narratives, which is a method of describing your research, which is essentially you tell the tale of how the design happened and what are the many different steps that led to the design decisions in your process. Okay, so what are some of the challenges of participatory design for learning analytics? How do we ensure this authentic participation, right? If we are not recruiting correctly, or if we're not necessarily thinking about this, how to create this third space, how do we actually make sure that these people that don't necessarily have knowledge of data can authentically participate when you're bringing them into the space? Secondly, how do we break barriers of mistrust and hierarchy? This was not referenced a lot in the literature, but embedded within our systems of education is the challenge for participatory design, that we have all sorts of different layers of power, right? An instructor has power over students, you know, a researcher will have power in that space. So when we're trying to create that third space where everybody is, you know, hopefully harmoniously co-designing and working together, what tools do we use to kind of like break those barriers that are embedded into the very system where we are creating our design? Who should be consulted? The question that we've talked about recruitment, right? Who should be in the room, and how do we decide who to invite, and how do we bring a lens of equity into that? Moreover, within education, unlike in some other participatory design that happens within technology for education, we generally don't have the capacity to follow people through long periods of time. Students come and go and they shift, you know, and everybody's time is very limited. So usually you have like these like workshops and kind of like very limited engagement. So how do we make those more productive and engaging? And finally, this is not a challenge, but kind of a thought, which is, what does PD open to us in terms of some of the questions that it might help us answer? So I'm going to share quickly two cases here about one that was done by our lab and one was done by UCI, where PD was used. And so you guys can see kind of some of the interesting things that can happen when we use participatory design. I might go through these a little bit quickly. So the first is this student-facing dashboard. And this is concerned a lot about how do we create this third space that I was talking about. So the objective was to create a dashboard for students using data from the LMS at NYU. And it was a partnership between the IT service that had this data and the Learn Research Network. In terms of a process, we started by creating a steering committee that basically had people from all sorts of different parts of the university. This is to kind of like get a sense of what the university's questions were for this dashboard. This is where kind of like power comes into play. And also so that we would have buy-in for when the dashboard was finished in order for it to actually get implemented. The first phase of the needs assessment process was a bunch of stakeholder interviews We spoke with 6 advisors, 13 students, and 3 faculty. Interestingly, the faculty were the ones that had the least to say in terms of the students' needs. That was actually aligned with the students' needs. But from here, we created a landscape of what were some of the challenges that different students were facing. And we had an equity lens recruitment in this phase. We mostly spoke with first-generation students. Then we led a bunch of co-design workshops. There were 3 5-hour, really long, basically day-long workshops with students. Again, we used an equity lens to recruit here. And there were first-year students, second-year students, and 1 graduate student participated. But we recruited especially amongst first gen. So from the first and second-year students, I think 80% of them were first generation, and then like 1 or 2 weren't. Also in the room were 2 facilitators who were PhD students and 1 UX designer. This is the schema of kind of like how one of the design sessions would have gone. You don't have to look at the details, but 2 things that were important for us. If you look at number 2, there was a mini lecture. We wanted to upscale our participants and make them learn something in the process. So we actually talked about kind of like design thinking, which was the methodology that we were using, and kind of why we're using them so that they could use the skill later on. The other interesting thing for us was step number 4, data mapping. One challenge that we had, right, was how do we get these students who don't daily think about data to think about data? So instead of giving them the data that was available to us, telling them these are the types of data, let's talk about which ones of them are important, we actually try to get them to instinctively think, what data we might have. And we kind of all collectively created this map together, which of course was filled in by us if there was a type of data available that they hadn't mentioned. The different bits of LMS data, the different bits of data that was just kind of created through the system in their different interactions with it. So this gave everybody kind of like a really good sense of what all this data was. And the rest is pretty kind of traditional design thinking workshop practice. So some of the principles that we were following when in this workshop was we try to keep a wide problem space. So we were not limiting the question of what we were creating to a dashboard, even though this thing was going to be data-based. We try to address power, the different tensions that happened. For example, when people started saying, hey, what happens here with surveillance? What happens with my privacy? This makes me feel uncomfortable. Instead of trying to make them feel better, we'd actually go deeper into any challenge that we saw that was kind of happening in the room. Moreover, we were very intentional about creating a safe design space. We used lots of icebreakers and different techniques that help people be vulnerable in front of each other. We would be vulnerable ourselves as well, because these things kind of create trust in the room and kind of allowed everybody to be pretty authentic in the feedback that they were given. What were some of the tools that were used? And I'll show you some images of this. First, we did empathy mapping with the students. So we had the needs that had come from the stakeholder interviews. We shared those needs with the students, and we helped them use those needs, but also fill out with their experience and their what they knew about their needs and the needs of other students to make to kind of create these user personas that were very, very rich and kind of like validated by these first-gen students' kind of own lived experience. Second technique that we used was design cards, which I'll show you in a second. They were used for upscaling the thinking of a student to the thinking of a designer. So they kind of had embedded in them the kinds of questions that a designer might be asking to the data, and they were used as a springboard for the students to ideate possible solutions for these dashboards. And finally, we had this other tool that was very useful, which was live prototyping. We had a designer in the room that was interacting with the students, and when students were kind of like thinking about a design, the designer would actually kind of come up, and maybe the student had a design, the designer would iterate on it, and then the student might create something else. So they were using the expertise of a real professional designer to come up with better prototypes. So this is a picture of the empathy mapping. We were basically kind of like looking at these profiles of students, and the students would kind of try to come up with different stories about what the student, who the student was that we were creating for, what they thought, what they said, what they feel, and what they do. They filled a lot of the information from their own experience or experiences of friends, as well as what we had brought in from our first interviews with other students to understand their needs. The second thing that I described there were these design cards that were used to help the thinking of the students. So we had cards that had verbs like, you know, this tool can know something, or it can tell you something, or it can compare something, right? Or it can connect you to something. And these were kind of like some of the questions that, you know, maybe this data might be able to answer. And there were also blank cards, so the students could actually create new cards of their own. So maybe this tool could tell you how motivated you are. And then, you know, if that was the question, that we could just combine these cards randomly and that came up, and that was a question that the students thought that maybe was interesting, then they would grab those cards and use that to create prototypes, right? So there was some randomness in the process, but then, you know, as they just like randomly combined, they would get to things that spoke to them, and then that's the stuff that students would try to create. And finally, as I said, we had live prototyping. So whatever the students came up with, they would share it with this designer. The designer would come up with other prototypes as the students themselves were also kind of coming up with prototypes. So a lot of different ideas emerged just from these 3 design sessions. So here's kind of like the whole process of how one possible dashboard was created. The cards basically kind of like where the cards that said, you know, maybe this dashboard will tell you what were your mistakes and what others did. This led to these students kind of coming up with this idea of some sort of tool that would look at their test and actually kind of like emphasize what they had done wrong, but also what others had done wrong. So what were the points in which their mistakes and the mistakes of their classmates were consistent, and where maybe they were different. This is a further iteration of the idea that I don't know if you can see, but the student had come up with this idea of like a dinosaur who's like, you know, little things where each one of the questions of the test, and this was then simplified, and you know, it would be kind of like a little mobile thing that would tell you, you know, this is the question, this is the right answer, this is where you had some consistency with your other classmates, and also would have like some space of communication with the instructor if they needed more information about what went wrong. And finally, to the right, we have the kind of a functional prototype of what the tool could have been. This other design they came up with, which was really interesting because it's very different from the dashboards that we have seen so far in learning analytics, is this idea of the hive. One of the challenges that students had was the complexity of like going into university. There's like too much stuff, too much knowledge. There's too many things, and they cannot organize their lives. So they came up with this idea of a space where like all of your courses were, and all of your needs, you know, kind of like immediate things that are about to explode on you, where you could see them more or less at a glance. This is a second prototype where we worked with the students, and we kind of had all of these different squares of the hives, which were the different courses, but also we included a square for their life. So there would be some sort of thing there that could remind students that their embedment in the community and their personal needs and their emotional needs were also important. So it would actually kind of like give them reminders about how to, you know, improve that as one of the areas of their existing in the university. These are further prototypes of kind of how this evolved, and this is kind of like the final tool, what it would have looked like, you know, in the desktop version. So it had like all of the different courses. It would give you all the reminders. Oops, sorry. It would give you all the reminders of kind of like what was going on and what was available, like all of the notifications. And it would also show you in terms of time, which weeks might be more busy in terms of kind of all the different activities that were happening. Now, sadly, the LMS, NYU changed from the LMS that they were using to a different LMS that actually doesn't make the data immediately available to us. So this tool was only developed up to the stage of functional prototype. But what's really interesting is that now we've just gone through a 2-year process with IDEO, a very big design firm, which is creating some tool and went through a similar process, not with us, by the way, this is completely parallel. But what's interesting is that the tool that they're coming up with is actually not very different from this. So it kind of confirms that some of the needs that we were going for actually, speak to reality. Anyway, some of the insights that we had from this process is that students don't just want a dashboard. There's a lot of other stuff that was important for them, like how to learn from each other. They wanted to have things that help them learn, like how to be an expert student, how to deal with their time in an expert way, and how to learn from each other and learn from the teacher. Also, interestingly, participant solutions had a lot of holistic, emotional, and storified design. So we think about the designs of the dashboards that we usually roll out into the world. They tend to be very dry, right? The design doesn't say much. Here, students, their designs had a lot of this component. So I wonder if there's something there that we should be incorporating when we're thinking about designing for higher education. I'm going to have to skip this. I'm sorry, because I'm kind of running a little bit out of time. So yeah, I'm gonna. So the second example that I had, which you guys can check for yourselves. Here. Sorry. Oops. Yeah. Wait. Is this dashboard called EdSite? It's a dashboard created by Juan and his team at UCI. And what's really interesting about it is that it has been created through a research and practice partnership for many years with teachers. And one thing that has happened time and time again is that the designers come up with an idea. For example, they wanted to the purpose of this dashboard was to help teacher trainers work with teachers as they were creating courses for math. And what would happen is, they would start with a dashboard, and the teachers would say, I don't want my data to be shown, to my advisor and to the district representative, through this dashboard. This makes me very uncomfortable, and I want you to protect my privacy. So then, then the designers would do something like, okay, let's create something that actually makes the sharing of the data voluntary. But once that happened, the trainers said, well, if the data of the sharing is voluntary and I don't see the data of my students, then I have no interest in this dashboard, right? There's like, if I don't see the data, I don't know why I'm involved in this process at all. Anyway, this discussion, this back and forth, actually led to the creation of this really, really interesting tool that allows the trainers to ask for the data and give a justification of why they want to see the data. And the dashboard, again, is there, and it shows kind of like, how the teachers have been doing and what the training is. But what's really important is that ultimately what the dashboard is doing well is creating a community of learning where people are discussing why we should have transparency about these things that kind of enables them to work better with it. Anyway, now moving from design of technology to the design of systems. So again, going back to the question, is our aim to just perpetuate or transform the status quo of education, right? And how does participatory design help us in this space? So what I have seen through the work that I've been doing in participatory design, and the more that I kind of work with technology, is that our relationship with the objects that we create is very, very much like not straightforward, right? For example, when you start kind of like putting data into a system and we create systems of transparency, they shift in very significant ways what we're encouraged to do, right? And there's a level of that which we design for. We want students to do this thing, but also there's a level in which there's lots of levels of unintended consequences to this process. And here there's some thinking. None of these are my ideas, by people like Latour and Frauenberg, about kind of the way that we are embedded with technology nowadays, and how that's very different to the way that we tend to look at technology as something that we just use. Technology is not just something that we use, but it's something that actually uses us, right? It acts on us. It shifts the way that we exist. I think kind of like a good tongue-in-cheek joke, but a good metaphor for how technology is using now is this movie called Megan, which is essentially like a metaphor of how, what happens when you give your kid the cell phone, right? And like you think you have control over this object that is going to entertain your child, but actually the object does its own thing, and it's doing the thing that it's supposed to do correctly. It just has consequences that you don't expect them to have. When we're talking about learning analytics, the fact that these objects will act on us has very, very deep implications, since we're kind of like working with things, with artifacts that create surveillance and that also use data. And data has this weird power of become reified, right? If you're a data expert, and I think some of you guys in the room are data experts, we know that we have to take data with a grain of salt. But it has actually been seen when we are kind of observing the thinking of people who are not used to use data. When they start looking at, say, dashboards or visualizations, they start to see that stuff, which is just a suggestion of imperfect and incomplete data, as the reality. And it's actually very, very hard to shift their thinking from this thing that looks objective, that looks almost more real, than the real interactions that they're having with the people in their classroom and their communities. In other words, the impacts of the work that we tend to be systemic, right? It goes way beyond the user and the problem and the little kind of like challenge that we're trying to solve. It actually impacts all sorts of different spaces. Yet the questions that we're asking to design tend to focus on the user level. Now, as I said before, one interesting thing about participatory design and why it is promising to answer this question is the fact that it tends to almost magically, when you bring all of these different points of view, to make you ask questions that go way, way beyond that limited question with a limited scope that you were asking at the start. So I'm going to skip this slide. These questions, by the way, are not new. There are multiple scholarly traditions that have been dealing with some of these challenges. Here, for 1 second, if you want to kind of take a picture of this, this is a bunch of different authors that have been working around the challenges that socio-technical systems create, and particularly the challenges that data creates. And this is kind of like, a little bit of like the reading list that has very much been informing my thinking around these themes recently. Finally, though, how do we adapt our design methods to these goals, right? We have these kind of big lofty goals of how we want our education to be. How should we be looking at our design processes? Well, first, here I just want to finish, kind of offer 5 different questions that we can start asking to move from just challenge or problem embedded human-centered learning analytics to actually systems embedded or community embedded learning analytics. First of all, what is the stakeholder landscape? Who are all the different people that will be impacted by these processes that we have? What are the different communities that might be impacted, and who can represent those communities truly, and how should we bring them into the room? Secondly, what are the myths that we should challenge? I was referring before to kind of this idea that data becomes kind of more real than reality. And also within learning analytics, we seem to have this idea that any problem can be solved as long as we have enough data and enough transparency. And the truth is, learning analytics can only take us so far, and there's often the space that we need to leave for things like community and communication, right, within these tools to actually deal with the challenges that we want to deal with. What is a pragmatic, utopic vision for the community, right? Instead of asking the question of what is a challenge that I want to solve, maybe the question that we should be asking is, what do we want this educational space to look like? And how can these tools that we have, this data, this learning analytics, this technology, help us actually shift towards that utopic vision, perhaps that value-based utopic vision on the forefront of everything that we do? How do we want to shape and reshape that community, right? Similarly, these are all about kind of human interactions with data and with these tools. So thinking about the way in which these complex systems are going to be working with the data should be central to our doing. And finally, how do we design not to just solve a problem, but to create spaces where there is dissent, right? Data kind of sometimes tends to sort of narrow the question to give you like a clear answer. but actually some recent writing about Charlotte Mouffe and democracy actually talks about this this idea of agonistic democracy, right? That a good democracy is a space where actually people are disagreeing, but they are disagreeing in a healthy way. They are actually being able to talk with each other about these disagreements. So how do we actually create learning analytics that instead of giving us an answer, actually open up a space for this dissent and for these different points of view? And with that, I finish. Thank you very much. And yeah, I open the stage for questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I invite everyone on the call to use your favorite emoji to thank Juan for such a fantastic talk. I'm going to stop recording.